Doubts about the ceasefire have pushed oil prices sharply higher. Iran is refusing to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, as we mentioned, saying it won't lift the blockade of the vital waterway unless Israel ends its attacks on Lebanon. Just a few ships managed to pass through the strait before Iran announced it would again be closed.
These blocked ships have been the center of attention since Iran and the US agreed a 2-week ceasefire. The deal was meant to reopen the Strait of Hormuz while the warring parties negotiated a longer-standing peace. There was hope the following day when maritime tracking data showed some vessels moving through the strait. But a heavy Israeli attack on Iranian-backed Hezbollah militia in Lebanon has set back the peace process. Iranian state media reported that traffic was stopped again and that several oil tankers that started heading through the strait reversed course. In the run-up to talks with the US, scheduled for Friday in Pakistan, Iran's parliament speaker accused the US of violating the ceasefire proposal. Major gaps remain. Iran is demanding continued control over the Strait of Hormuz and wants to charge ships a fee for transiting the strait. The prospect prompted widespread opposition.
We are here to actually pronounce what the law actually says, and international law provides for the freedom of navigation, which means what? It means basically no payment or toll whatsoever.
This remains one of the most critical issues in the implementation of the agreement, because should Iran succeed in obtaining the right to impose additional duties on transit through the strait, this could lead to economic consequences and shifts in trade flows that are at present impossible to predict.
Donald Trump is still promising the strait will be open and safe. A rocky start to peace talks, leaving more than 1,000 vessels stuck in limbo.
I spoke earlier with Ben Farrell, CEO of the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply in Peterborough, England. He told me about the impact the Iran war is having on global supply chains.
Yeah, very severely, really. I'll just give you some statistics. Clearly, we're aware of the oil and gas price inflation that has resulted. There are probably a few other less obvious impacts. I'd like to just highlight the impact on food supply, actually, as a result, perhaps, of fertilizer. So dry bulk food that was coming out of the Strait of Hormuz has reduced by, I think, 83% through March, and fertilizer by 92%. So that is going to impact nations who normally receive their fertilizer. For example, Malawi, where there's 60% of their fertilizer comes through the straits. And then there's the sort of petrochemical cascade, as they call it, with plastics, which is beginning to emerge as an issue, particularly if you sort of combine the point about fertilizer with agriculture and irrigation pipes, where that would be necessary to build to grow food this year. So about 50% of the global food produced requires fertilizer, and about 30% of that's coming out of the Strait of Hormuz. So, there are just a few examples to point out. We can point to the risk of helium, which is needed for the development of some transistors in microchips, rather, used for sort of 5G communication. So, it's difficult to understate the impact of what's going on. And I've seen quite a lot of, we have offices in the Middle East, replanning in supply routes, people looking for alternative ports, and, the knock-on effect of that, thinking about, fuel limitations. So there's almost a constant readjustment of supply chains and the management of supply chains going on in flight. And to sort of finalize this point, I think this has raised a big question about 4 decades of globalization that has created an environment that is vulnerable to what I call the era of choke points. And you can see that in the Straits of Hormuz, in the Panama Canal, Suez Canal, in the Strait of Malacca, for example, and the criticality of some raw materials in supply. So one way and another, I think this is pretty significant as a shock and a recognition of the way the global supply of trade has developed over the years.
So this is causing pain globally. It's affecting food security, it sounds like. It's certainly affecting consumers' pocketbooks around the world. Are there any regions of the world that you can say have genuinely benefited from this war economically?
In all honesty, as you say that, nowhere comes to mind. There's obviously discussion around maybe Russia and some of the outcome of the adjustment. I've seen a few nations who have responded in a way that would be entirely sensible to offer alternatives. For example, I was listening to Mr. Dangote, who runs a very large business across Africa from Nigeria, pointing to the Nigerian, oil and gas industry and saying there are alternatives. And it made me think really about, the point about vulnerability and the nature of supply, and that to some extent, no one's particularly benefiting from it. But what might come out is the way that people are looking perhaps at different diversification of sourcing plans for critical supply and national resilience as a result. I also noticed that, some of the raw materials in fertilizer, for example, might be available through Morocco, but it's not typically been recognised as the route. So what is beginning to emerge are alternatives to the current sourcing, recognising that sort of eggs are in one basket in many cases.
What's your advice then to businesses that are trying to navigate in this great time of uncertainty? What are you telling your members there who are trying to figure out how to cope with this?
Yeah, it's a great point. So we've been holding a series of sort of crisis response webinars where we had amazing response. We had 110 nations the other day on a call, all talking about managing supply chains and responding. And typically I've been saying, my advice is to continually thinking of these as rather more like supply webs, which develop choices. You can take different courses of action if one becomes untenable, and thinking rather differently about how we've considered supply chains in the past. There may be a premium on that level of resilience, which I think perhaps is one of the outcomes of this conversation. We've also seen some dynamic replanning. We have a number of very active WhatsApp groups around the Middle East, for example, where I see in real time individuals asking for advice on what's happening in particular ports, where there are options to resupply, to use other supply routes and supply chains. So what is going on is a sort of collaborative network of people responding and replanning in real time. So that's the sort of short-term response, and we're able to help facilitate that. And then longer term, I think there's a question mark about where critical national supplies come from, and the recognition of alternative sourcing and longer-term planning. So I do think this is a moment where we ought to recognise the need for resilience in supply chains, and thinking rather differently about that, and recognizing there are critical vulnerabilities around the world. So it's a question of continuous replanning at the moment, seeking advice, intelligence pictures as to what's going on, and then thinking longer term about reshaping how people think about their supply.
Ben, thank you very much for your insights today. That was Ben Farrell, Global CEO of the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply.
Thank you.
Well, let's dig a little deeper into the economic fallout from the Iran war. We've got Beata Javorcik with us for that. She's chief economist at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in London. Thanks for coming in today, Beata. Your bank is active in many countries, covering Europe, the Balkans, Central Asia, and also the Middle East. How is the war in Iran affecting the regions you serve?
The war has already had profound implications on the region. The most affected countries are those in southern Eastern Mediterranean. We see the cost of borrowing becoming much higher. It's a big deal for Egypt, where the cost of servicing foreign debt or public debt account for 90% of government revenues. Wow. It's an issue for countries like Jordan, for whom tourism revenues are equivalent to about 15% of GDP. Lower tourism flows mean a much lower economic activity. Many of those countries have trade and remittances links. But of course, all other regions are also affected through energy prices.
And what about your bank? Your bank is a development bank, and basically, how is it affecting the work you do, the projects that you have in place in some of these regions, and how do you think it'll impact you moving forward?
Well, we expect greater demand for our investments, particularly in renewable energy. To date, half of our investments have been devoted to the green space, but of course, renewables are part of energy mix. They increase resilience of countries in terms of energy security. I expect that trade disruptions will mean that firms will be looking for new trading partners, so they will want trade finance instruments that ensure transactions. We are very active in that space as well. And finally, I think many firms, including SMEs, will want to become more energy efficient. So green credit lines, which come with advice on what to invest in to become more energy efficient.
The Trump administration's policies and actions, not least in the Middle East, have upended the international order. It has a huge impact on the international economy, still having that impact. How is this affecting your institution and the lending it does?
Well, the one channel through which regions where we operate have been affected is trade policy, changes in the U.S. trade policy. For many of our countries, U.S. is not an important export market because of geography, because of the distance. So the channel that has been the most important is impact on German economy, because what happens in Germany spills over into export demand from Eastern Europe, from North Africa. And I think we have not seen the full impact of the new U.S. tariffs yet, because of a lot of exports from Europe entered the U.S. market in the first quarter of last year before the tariffs came into effect.
With nationalism and protectionism on the rise, not just in the U.S., is globalization today, as we've known it, effectively dead?
It's not dead, but the face of globalization is changing. So we have seen some rolling back of globalization, starting with the Brexit vote, the US-China trade war, disruptions of supply chains during COVID. But at the same time, countries are seeing more and more acutely that diversification of supply chains, including energy supply chains, has become more important.
Your bank just released a flagship report. That's why you're in Berlin today presenting this report. It highlights how demographic trends are impacting the economy. What's the main message there?
The main message is that the time to act is now. Demographic trends are quietly eroding our standards of living as the workforce tends to shrink faster than population as a whole.
You're talking about developed economies here in Europe, or what?
As well as Eastern European countries, which got old before getting rich. They are now as old as advanced economies at 1/3 of income per capita. But you know, the biggest or the most underappreciated impact of the turbulence and the war is that policymakers have to focus on the urgent, on the shock that's happening today, this week, this month, and the important structural issues that are happening remain unaddressed.
Like demographics.
Like demographics, because they get pushed down the list, because you need to focus on what is urgent.
And what is urgent right now? I mean, the war in Iran is having an impact on oil markets, and that's having a knock-on effect on inflation and everything around the world. But what are the most urgent problems in the economies that you're dealing with that need to be addressed right now?
Well, what needs to be addressed is things that make economies more competitive. With the risk of stagflation looming somewhere on the horizon if the conflict continues, countries need to focus on making their economies more competitive. And the way you do it is by removing constraints, by improving governance, by making the business climate better. But, demography also matters because the window to act is now, because as societies age, the preferences of the older voters will become more important, and older voters are more hostile to pension reforms.
The relationship between economics and politics. Beata Javorcik, the chief economist of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.